On the other hand, the Supreme Court's independence compared to its predecessors, the law lords, has perhaps made it more willing to challenge government and parliament. This can be seen in a number of cases challenging government decisions, such as ultra vires rulings against the freezing of terror suspects' assets in 2010, against Jeremy Hunt of the closure of Lewisham Hospital's Accident and Emergency Department in 2013, and against the Welfare to Work scheme of that same year, not to mention the controversial 2016 Brexit ruling itself. So in sum then, an argument can be made that the combined effect of the Factor Tame case, the 1998 Human Rights Act, and the 2005 Constitutional Reform Act has been to increase the power and assertiveness of the judiciary, as well as giving them hugely increased scope to challenge the government on human rights grounds. In other words, they have served to push the judiciary into the political fray. They have politicized the judiciary. However, this argument overlooks a number of factors. First of all, the mechanisms to preserve judicial independence remain fully in place. By judicial independence, of course, we mean that the judiciary is not controlled by politicians, that there's a strict separation of powers between an independent judiciary on the one hand and the other two branches of government, the executive and parliament, on the other. The purpose of judicial independence, of course, is to make sure that judges can apply the law properly without fear of any political consequences or ramifications. And so, of course, the argument would be that if judicial independence is maintained, then we do not have a politicization of the judiciary, because the judiciary is not being subject to political pressure. So, and the argument is that actually all the mechanisms in place to maintain judicial independence are still there. So we still have security of tenure, for example, appointment for life. That still exists. That exists, of course, to ensure that judges can't be sacked or threatened with dismissal by politicians, to ensure that their independence is guaranteed. They have guaranteed salaries, so that their salaries can't be threatened by Parliament or government. We have the existence of contempt of court proceedings, designed to keep court proceedings out of the press, and therefore make sure there's no political pressure coming from the press during court cases. And of course, we still have the training and experience of senior judges to ensure that they, in their own professional training, are personally invulnerable and immune to political pressure. And indeed, judicial independence, as already mentioned, has actually been increased by recent reforms. So the Constitutional Reform Act 2005 was specifically designed to enhance the separation of powers between the judiciary and the other two branches of government. We've already mentioned how it removed the senior judges from Parliament to sit in a separate Supreme Court, but it also substantially reduced the powers of the executive over the judiciary. It did this by reducing the powers of the Lord Chancellor, and specifically reducing his powers over appointments by establishing an independent appointment system. So it established a judicial appointments commission for most judges, and an ad hoc 5-person committee for the Supreme Court, which replaced the old system where the Lord Chancellor effectively made his own decision on behalf of the government after taking so-called secret soundings, basically secret discussions with other judges, seen as a very impenetrable and unaccountable system in which the executive, through the Lord Chancellor, had a lot of power. That system's gone. Now you have this independent commission. So all of this has served, arguably, to make the judiciary more independent. And the effect of this increased independence has arguably been not to politicize the judiciary, but to depoliticize it by making it less subject to political control by the executive. Likewise, all the mechanisms to ensure judicial neutrality or impartiality similarly remain in place. By judicial neutrality, just to remind ourselves, of course, we mean that the judges are to be impartial in their administration of justice. And the mechanisms to ensure this, by and large, still remain in place. The judges are supposed to remain anonymous, effectively. Not that their names are secret from the public, but they're not supposed to have really a public profile, do media interviews, make comments to the media about their rulings and so on. They're not supposed to be involved in political campaigning. They can vote, but they should not campaign or make their political views known. These are known as the Kilmuir guidelines, K-I-L-M-U-I-R guidelines. They have to provide legal justifications for their rulings, again, to show that there's a legal basis rather than just coming to a decision on the basis of prejudice or political opinion. And of course, again, their high-level training is supposed to ensure their impartiality. Thus, although recent reforms have perhaps increased the work of the judiciary, this work consists, as it always has done, solely of interpreting and applying the law, not making it. So the increased number of judicial reviews simply reflects the reality that Parliament itself decided to pass a Human Rights Act, and the courts are now obliged to enforce it. They have no more power to actually make political decisions now than they ever did. They cannot strike down legislation which offends the Human Rights Act, for example. They can only recommend that it be altered. And executive decisions deemed ultra vires by the courts can always be got around by simply passing an Act of Parliament granting ministers new powers. In the 2008 R versus Davis case, for example, where the law lords had ruled against the use of anonymous witnesses in courts, the government simply introduced new legislation into a parliament which did allow such witnesses. Similarly, legislation allowing for the asset freezing of terror suspects was passed following the Supreme Court's judgment ruling ultra vires in 2010. So parliamentary sovereignty thus ultimately ensures not only that judges cannot overturn legislation, but the Parliament can ultimately legalise any ministerial action it pleases, and judges can do nothing to stop them. So far then, I have argued that recent reforms have not resulted in a significant politicisation of the judiciary. However, other factors may well have done so. One such factor is the increasing willingness of politicians and media outlets to comment on judges' decisions. The 2016 Supreme Court ruling on Brexit was, as we've mentioned, severely criticised by the media, but also by Brexit Minister David Davis. Politicians are not supposed to comment on judges' rulings. That's one of the principles of judicial neutrality, one of the mechanisms to uphold it. And Davis is not the only politician to have openly criticised the judges. Tony Blair's Home Secretary David Blunkett called the judges dictators in wigs, following a string of rulings against him. So here we can see a combination of the right-wing media and leading politicians working together to put political pressure on the judges to fall in line with the government of the day. This is indeed a politicisation, but it's not a result of recent reforms. Rather, it results from the actions of irresponsible politicians and newspaper editors. Similarly, the pressure exerted on the judiciary in the wake of the 2011 riots, when the Ministry of Justice instructed the courts to ignore sentencing guidelines and imprison everyone involved, was another example of politicisation. Again, not politicisation in the sense of judges making political decisions, but in the sense of politicians controlling what should be strictly judicial decisions. Another factor behind politicisation is that the judiciary remains overwhelmingly white, male, economically privileged, and often privately educated. So, racial variations in sentencing, with Asians over 40% more likely to receive prison time for drug offences than whites, for example, suggests that this limited social background does influence the judge's outlook, undermining their impartiality. Worryingly, these discrepancies seem to be getting worse over time. This reflects perhaps a rise in racial stereotyping due to the war on terror and growing hostility towards immigration. Again, this can be seen as a type of politicisation, as it shows how political circumstances can influence court judgments and undermine judicial neutrality. But again, this is not a politicisation resulting from specific reforms, but from the political climate itself. So in conclusion, the key reforms affecting the judiciary in recent years, the Human Rights Act, the Constitutional Reform Act, and Britain's involvement with the EU, have not resulted in a significant politicisation of the courts, I argue. Whilst they have expanded the scope of the judiciary's work, this work remains limited to the interpretation and application of law made by Parliament. Parliamentary sovereignty means judges cannot overturn acts of Parliament, nor can they prevent Parliament from authorising ministerial actions which would otherwise be ultra vires. The judges cannot create law today any more than they ever could. To the extent the judiciary have been politicised, in the sense of becoming more vulnerable to political pressure, this has been a direct result of the irresponsible actions of individual politicians and newspaper editors, working together to create a climate of hostility towards certain groups and pressuring judges to fall in line with their opinions. This politicization has nothing to do with reforms and everything to do with reaction. Thank you very much.